I'm going to give a presentation here for the next 20 minutes or so. And oftentimes people will say to me, James, can you give me just an overview or something that I should share with people? What are the most important issues? What are the fundamental issues in the global warming debate? Now, Lord Monckton touched upon some of the granular issues, sea level rise being one of them, tornadoes, hurricanes, etc. I've done that as well, and we'll do so tomorrow. But I'd like to right now just give an overview of the debate. So first of all, it's important to understand that if we're talking climate science, and we're often accused of not following science, it's important to know what science is, because really it's the alarmists that are deliberately not following science. Science is the scientific method. The scientific method defines science. The scientific method encourages and requires testing predictions and hypotheses with real-world observations. The scientific method is not you poll certain people, you choose who you want to ask questions to, and you report what you think the majority answer is. It is testing a hypothesis. True scientists welcome such skepticism and testing. They encourage it rather than vilify it. If anybody presents an argument, a criticism, that people are challenging scientists, criticizing scientists. Actually, no, what we're doing is challenging their assertions. We're performing science. Second, climate models that merely predict future temperatures are not proof. They're predictions. At best, they are very weak evidence, but even that's stretching the term evidence. They are somewhat informed predictions. It's not scientific proof or scientific evidence. Also, climate models that merely predict future climate change impacts, hurricanes, tornadoes, droughts, floods, etc., again, are not proof of anything. They're predictions. And especially when we know, as Lord Monckton showed, as other climate realists have showed, as the scientific data show, if these events are not occurring in the real world, well, then real-world evidence trumps predictions and theories. What are the parameters of the debate in terms of points of agreement, points of dispute? This is important because oftentimes climate alarmists would like to have us believe that it's an argument over, is the Earth warming or is it not warming? You denialists pretend the Earth isn't warming. No. Climate realists, myself included for decades, have acknowledged what is in fact shown by scientific evidence. First, the Earth has been warming for more than a century, even before we had coal-fired power plants and SUVs. Also, that human activity is likely a factor. Carbon dioxide is a greenhouse gas. If you add more to the environment, you're probably going to get some more warming. But the points in contention are how much of the warming that we have experienced is natural versus human caused. That's a pretty significant issue. The fact that we're causing some warming doesn't mean we're causing all of it. How much future warming is likely? That gets closer to the heart of the debate. Even if humans are causing all of the warming, which is highly unlikely, nevertheless, if the warming does not create severely negative implications, and perhaps may even be beneficial, you don't have a global warming crisis. And finally, what will the consequences of any such warming be? Again, those are the more key questions. And when we hear talk about consensus this, consensus that, the only polls or surveys that are presented by alarmists, as flawed as their methodology is, nevertheless, even so, even if we accept their methodology, still the key questions that are asked are simply, has the Earth warmed? Are humans playing a role? Well, you just heard me say yes. I'm part of the 97% that they like to present, but those aren't the issues that are really in contestation. So, if you walk away from my talk remembering only one thing, I want you to remember this. We cannot have a global warming crisis if temperatures are unusually cool rather than unusually warm. I mean, that's common sense. How can you have a global warming crisis if temperatures are not excessively warm? And the scientific evidence, the objective scientific evidence, the verified peer-reviewed scientific evidence shows that temperatures are unusually cool, not warm. So this here is, these charts are presented by the European Science Foundation. That is a project by the Greenland Ice Core Project. These are temperatures that were taken by drilling ice cores into the Greenland ice sheet. They withdraw the ice sheet, and from those ice cores, they're able to determine what past temperature was. It is not in dispute. I'd like you to take a look at the top right chart. What you see on the far right, those are temperatures today, and as you move to the left in that chart, you're going back 10,000 years of temperatures. Notice that for most of the past 10,000 years, and especially most of the past 8,000 years, in other words, the period in which human civilization first developed and flourished, temperatures were significantly warmer than today. It's been rare that temperatures have been any cooler than today. How can we have a climate crisis when we have a long way to go just to reach temperatures that are more usual during the period of human civilization. At the bottom, you see the past 2,000 years. Again, current temperatures are on the right. That small amount of warming you see at the far right, still, that's the warming of the past century, still leaves us short of the temperatures that predominated during the medieval warm period, when when Vikings were able to prosper in Greenland. So again, we don't have unusually warm temperatures. Therefore, we don't have a global warming crisis. This is a chart that is taken directly from the United Nations' very first Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change Assessment Report. And you see the same thing. Look at the top. This is going back 1 million years. Current temperatures are at the far right during our current interglacial warm period. When you look at the record, you see periods of about 100 to 150,000 years of cooling temperatures and ice ages, interrupted briefly, on average by about 10 or 15,000 years, by interglacial warm periods. Notice that every single one of the past at least 6 interglacial warm periods was as warm or warmer than current temperatures. The planet does not have a fever. The planet is abnormally cool compared to past interglacial warm periods. The middle chart, you see this confirms what we saw from the Greenland Ice Core project. Again, throughout most of human civilization, over most of the past 8,000 years, temperatures were warmer than today. And the bottom chart, we see the same thing. Temperatures in the Little Ice Age certainly bottomed out in the 1600s. Temperatures bottomed out. We have recovered somewhat, but still, even with that recovery, we're still cooler than temperatures that existed during the medieval warm period. This chart here is produced from Geophysical Research Letters. It is a peer-reviewed scientific journal. It's one of the most prestigious scientific journals that deal with Earth sciences. Now, what you have here is a reconstruction of solar output, solar irradiance, going back to the year 1600. Look at this pattern. This shows that the sun is not at a constant level of energy production, but the sun's energy output varies. So we see that in the 1600s, the sun's output was at a minimum. There was a step up in the 1700s, then solar output leveled out, plateaued until about the year 1900, then a step up again during the past century. Does that look familiar to you, that pattern? It should, because look again at the United Nations' own report, the bottom chart. Look at temperatures going back during that same time period. Temperatures bottomed out in the 1600s, stepped up and plateaued until about 1900, and then stepped up again. We can see that looking at the history of solar output, it has been an exact or near exact correlation with temperatures. This tells us that nature, not carbon dioxide, has historically driven earthly temperatures. We would need some evidence to show that that has changed if we're going to believe that that has changed. Now what we have is temperature measurements from NASA satellites. This is a chart on the right that goes back to the year 1979. What you see is that temperatures, you don't see an acceleration of warming at any point during the past 40 plus years. You see a modest, steady warming that is occurring at a pace of about 0.14 degrees per decade, which would equate to 1.4 degrees Celsius per century, which is far less than climate alarmists in the media tell us is happening. Indeed, when we look at the predictions of the United Nations and climate alarmists, we see that they have been proven wrong by objective data, and in fact, embarrassingly wrong. So on the left, I pulled a couple notes from this. From the very first United Nations climate assessment in 1990, the UN predicted 0.3 degrees Celsius of warming per decade. Again, we see on the data on the right that warming has occurred at less than half of that pace. Now, when skeptics challenged that 0.3 degrees Celsius of warming per decade, we were vilified as skeptics and deniers and being anti-science, and yet the science has backed us up. So subsequently, recent UN climate assessment reports now predict 0.2 degrees warming Celsius per decade. In other words, on their own, they've already met us in the middle. They've already said, well, if you're wrong, you're no wrong than we were, no more wrong than we were. And yet they're going to have to come down again because the warming continues at a pace of 0.14 degrees Celsius. The point of this is this. When people say that it's scientists and science versus climate deniers, the factual evidence shows that it is climate realists, skeptics of the asserted climate crisis, who have been proven on the most core and important issue to be closer to the truth than climate alarmists. Temperatures are warming, but not nearly as much as alarmists predicted. In fact, much closer to what climate realists have said. Next, I'd like to talk about emissions, because here at the United Nations Climate Conference, there is a great deal of vilification of the United States and, in a more broad context, Western democracies. We need to pay up in climate reparations for the damage we're doing to the developing world. It is our sins, our emissions that are to blame. But the actual data tell a different story. What you see on the bottom of this chart, the dark blue line, that is nearly flat but declining somewhat, those are United States carbon dioxide emissions since the year 2000. Our emissions this century have declined more than any nation on the face of the earth. What you see at the very top, the medium blue line, where you see this substantial increase over time, those are emissions for the rest of the world. Those who are criticizing the United States and saying that we are outlaws with our climate policy. And by the way, the light turquoise line that starts at the very bottom but then becomes the middle line towards the right, those are China's emissions. What you see is that most of the emissions growth in the world, about 75% of emissions growth in the world this century, is caused by China. Yet, according to the Paris Accord and what the United Nations would have the United States and the Western democracies abide by in the future, we are supposed to provide money and assistance to China as reparations for our climate sins. In fact, U.S. emissions are down 14% this century. The rest of the world, emissions are up 66%. If we're looking for effective climate policy, the solution is not global socialism, global totalitarianism, global yielding of power to the United Nations, which has failed in its stated mission. It should be emulating the free market policies of the United States, which have proven to work. One final point I'd like to address, and this is, what is really the environmentally friendly solution? What are the environmental issues that count? If you listen to the climate activist community, the only environmental issue that exists is carbon dioxide emissions. But we know that's not the case. Environmentalism was an issue before 1990 in the first United Nations Climate Assessment Report. So one of the things that bothers climate realists is the fact that the so-called solutions being pushed by the United Nations are far more environmentally destructive than anything they claim from modestly warming temperatures. Now on the right, what you see, this is a screenshot of a Harvard University study. This was peer-reviewed and published, Harvard University scientists in 2018, who believe in a climate crisis. But they said, if we're going to solve this, what are going to be the implications? And you can see the title of their paper, Large-Scale Wind Power Would Require More Land and Cause More Environmental Impact Than Previously Thought. The gist of the paper was that you would have to carpet 1/3 of America's landmass with wind turbines to replace conventional energy with renewable power. Wind power is by far the dominant renewable energy source. If you were to carpet 1/3 of America's landmass with wind turbines, you would be destroying entire ecosystems. You would be destroying the environmental habitat that is necessary for the nurturing and preservation of wildlife in this country. You can't get around that. I cannot think of anything more environmentally destructive than carpeting 1/3 of the landmass with wind projects. A few quotes from that study. Oh, and by the way, it's not even going to reduce temperatures. Here are a few quotes. First of all, this is from the Harvard University press release on the paper itself. Harvard University researchers find that the transition to wind or solar power in the United States would require 5 to 20 times more land than previously thought. Next, to estimate the impacts of wind power, they covered 1/3 of the continental U.S. with enough wind turbines to meet present-day electricity demand. That's how much it would take to replace coal, oil, and natural gas with wind power. And finally, the researchers found this scenario would warm the surface temperature of the United States by 0.24 degrees Celsius, with the largest changes occurring at night when surface temperatures increase by up to 1.5 degrees Celsius. This warming is a result of wind turbines actively mixing the atmosphere near the ground and aloft while simultaneously extracting from the atmosphere's motion. This research supports more than 10 other studies that observed warming near operational U.S. wind farms. Folks, it might feel good to say you're doing something about global warming, to think you're doing something about global warming, but if what you are proposing is going to be more environmentally destructive than the so-called problem, and if the science shows we're not facing a climate crisis at all, and if the science shows that temperatures are abnormally cool rather than warm, I think it's more important to protect the environment and protect human health and welfare than to have feel-good platitudes and politicians being able to take credit for solving a crisis that does not exist. In conclusion, just remember, it's the scientific method in science that trumps messaging, backslapping, and greenwashing. If we adhere to the scientific method, you're going to discover, and the planet will discover, and I believe we will because human people are innately intelligent and discerning, that we are not facing a climate crisis. Thank you very much. I'd like to introduce the next speaker, or do we have questions, Jim?
We have a few questions.
All right, I'll take questions, my favorite part.
First of all, this is actually my question. So,
Uh-oh.
so I thought of during your presentation. Where did this idea that we have to keep the temperatures from rising more than 1.5 degrees Celsius by 2100 come from? It seems to me to have been you and I were in Paris together in 2015. I believe they wanted to keep it, their number was more ambitious than that, and they ended up settling with 1.5. But it seems to me that that number was just pulled out of the air. What is the difference in the globe's status?
It's
if
a political...
If it's 1.5 degrees Celsius or
Yeah.
2 degrees Celsius.
Yeah, great question. It's a political construct. It allows them to give a figure that both gives them time to say we have time if we act right now, but we haven't quite reached the 1.5 degrees Celsius rise since the dawn of the Industrial Revolution. So if we act right now, we can hit there, and guess what? That's what we have to hit. But it's funny because before Paris, or even during Paris, they were saying 2.0 degrees Celsius was the important number to hit. 2.0 degrees Celsius of warming since the dawn of the Industrial Revolution. But climate activists complained that it gave us too much wiggle room and it didn't require zero carbon right away. So they said, whoa, lo and behold, actually 1.5 is the magic number. It has nothing to do with science. It has everything to do with supporting and just giving basis to a political agenda.
Okay. So how do you think people should react when they hear that the UN through specific policies will be able to keep the temperature down by a fraction of a degree Celsius? I mean, it seems to me that that's fantasy. That what policies are going to actually do that? They don't know. They can't know, right?
Right. And even if you look at the U.S. Environmental Protection Agency's own climate models, if we were to eliminate all U.S. emissions immediately, still, by the end of the century, the amount of warming that would be averted would be minuscule. I believe it's less than 0.1 degrees Celsius. In other words, it would just mean the warming that would otherwise have occurred in the year 2200, or we'll say 2100, will have occurred instead in like 2102. Listen, nature has always ruled the climate. The sun's output primarily has always dominated as far as an impact on temperatures. We're probably contributing a little bit at the margins. The band of absorption for carbon dioxide regarding radiation is almost saturated, so adding more carbon dioxide to the atmosphere has very little impact. But even if it did, again, recall the presentation, the slide at the beginning of my presentation that shows the temperatures from the United Nations itself. Temperatures have historically been much warmer than today. We're not facing a climate crisis. The Earth doesn't have a fever. The Earth has a cold. It almost has pneumonia.
Can you address? Somebody mentioned this: the sheer number of birds, especially raptors and bats, that are killed by wind turbines, even at the current pretty paltry level of wind turbines in the United States compared to what they demand, which is, as you said, covering 1/3 of the entire continental United States.
Yeah, that's a great question. And again, for people who treasure the environment, for people who treasure wildlife, these are things we have to look out for. Peer-reviewed studies. And by the way, these were conducted a few years ago before we have the full amount of wind turbines we have today, before we have even more that are being advocated. Peer-reviewed studies, data, actual counts, showed that in the United States alone, wind turbines kill approximately 1.5 million birds and bats each and every year, including many protected and endangered species. Bird numbers are declining rather dramatically in the United States, bat numbers even more so. This is something that should concern all of us. And yet we're told the green thing to do is to slaughter more of them. You cannot have wind turbines running our economy, our energy economy, without slaughtering birds and bats by the million. And I think that's a far greater concern.
And there is no if your wind turbine happens to kill an endangered bird, you're not sued by the federal government. You're not in any trouble for that, are you?
Yeah, it's interesting because if there is an accidental byproduct of, let's say, an endangered bird happens to die in some water reservoir that some fracking company has put up, and the bird accidentally happened to fall in there and through nothing that was really foreseeable, but nevertheless die, you are on the hook for substantial penalties from the federal government. But if you operate a wind turbine, which foreseeably and essentially by design slaughters birds and bats, including endangered species, you're not held accountable. It's a double standard that is preposterous. And again, any true environmentalist would be outraged and is outraged by that duplicity in treatment.
And then just one last, speaking of that, I mean, you had put up there a slide that says you'd have to cover 1/3 of the continental United States to quote, meet present electricity demand. It seems that the people here at COP26, who, if you want to grant them good intentions, they would say that, well, we wouldn't have to cover the 1/3 of the United States with wind turbines. It's not really possible to do that, even logistically. But they say, well, we wouldn't have to meet present electricity demands because I think the best case scenario is we would be exponentially more efficient, right? I think that's the way you could solve that, and it's, I suppose, technically possible. But then I think, because I'm more of a cynic, I think of the worst case scenario, which is basically that only the rich will be able to afford reliable power, and that the poorest, not just in the third world, but in the developed Western world, including the United States, the poor would just have to do with unreliable power or do even worse. Is that too cynical, or is that the way this would have to work out?
No, well, if you look at, let's start with the United States, which is a developed country. It's not a situation where you're having people who previously did not have electricity now getting electricity. And in the United States, you see a small but gradual increase, consistent increase in electricity consumption each year. Each time that we upgrade the ability of computers to process data, it's running more energy to do so. That's just one example. But we are seeing a slight and gradual increase in electricity production and usage. But really, the bigger question is this. The environmental activists, well, the climate activists, they're not advocating for the environment, want to electrify transportation. In fact, they demand that we have electric vehicles that replace gasoline-powered vehicles with electric ones. Now, if we were to do that, instead of carpeting 1/3 of the country to replace current electricity, now you'd be looking at covering literally 1/2 of the American landmass to meet current electricity without any increases from the uses we currently have, plus the electrification of transportation. Folks, again, I don't see how anyone could look at that situation and say that's a green solution. It's about the most environmentally destructive thing we can imagine, would certainly be the most environmentally destructive thing that humans have ever done to the environment. And that includes if we go back to the 1950s and 60s before the Clean Air Act. Again, this would be devastating to the environment. Jim, I'm guessing that that's it? All right, very good. Time runs short, but feel free to keep posting comments, questions. I can always address them via email as well.